with Richard Heinberg. Richard Heinberg is Senior Fellow at resilience.org and the Post-Carbon Institute. How are you doing today, Richard?
I'm doing pretty well. And yourself?
Pretty well. It's Monday, June the 8th, 2020. There are, I have a number of concerns, actually, Richard. I mean, there's things going on in the world right now which are greatly concerning to me, not least of which the execution of a person in the United States by one person standing on his neck with his knee, and several other people just standing there and doing nothing. So I'm very concerned. I mean,
yeah,
I'm not the only one.
Right. Well, actually, I think it's very positive that we're seeing the institutionalized racism of this country being questioned so dramatically and prominently and widely at this moment. It's a subject that goes right back to the origin of the country. I mean, the country was founded on slavery and genocide. And let's not forget what the native peoples of this continent have experienced and continue to experience as a result of the European immigrants who took over the place. And so, you know, a lot of Americans are hearing about institutionalized racism and police violence against African Americans and so on. But this is something with a deep history. I mean, the Civil War was fought over slavery, obviously, and then we had the Jim Crow era. We had we had loan programs in this country, government-backed mortgage programs that were only for white people. So, you know, white people got a systematic boost, and Black people were systematically held down and held back. The same thing with the war on drugs. It was Nixon started it with the very clear intention of putting a lot of Black men in prison and disempowering the African American community systematically. So this has been going on for a long time in a lot more ways, I think, than most white people are aware of. And now suddenly we have hundreds of thousands of people out in the streets, Black and white, which is key. If it were only African Americans out in the street, it would not be as significant as the fact that there are white people out there also, all skin colors, all ages, men, women. This is a significant moment in American history. And it's a significant moment for the Trump presidency, because as many people have been saying, and I certainly have said right from the beginning, Trump is a natural born authoritarian. And he has been doing everything in his power to turn the US into a dictatorship with the help recently of Bill Barr, especially. I think he's been the most significant helper, but also, of course, the US Senate and Mitch McConnell and so on. And that calculus has changed as a result of people in the streets, because students of the history of authoritarianism say, you know, once the process gets going of turning a democracy into a dictatorship, it's very hard to halt. The one thing that can halt it is people in the street. And it's not as though all of these demonstrations were just about Donald Trump. I'm sure he likes to think everything is about him. But nevertheless, they drew a lot of their energy and fuel from pent up resentments against not just his style of leadership, but the racism he embodies, that he carries from his own family history, and that I mean, how did he get into politics in the first place? Through birtherism, by claiming fraudulently that President Obama was not qualified to be president because he was born in Kenya, as Trump claimed,
Which was false.
which was false. Yeah, but it was a racist argument on its fault, on its face. And that's how he became president. As the reaction of older white Americans to the spectacle of having a competent, articulate African American president. So here we are, and it's, as I say, it's a dramatic moment in our history. But I think to be seen in context, we have to understand, where this has come from, and it's a bigger, much more interesting story.
It's interesting that you bring up this point today, Richard, because I have tried so mindfully and intentionally to include in my social media circle people from all walks of life, all socioeconomic levels. And one of the ways I've done that is to try to include, from my very, very small school that I attended, 300 kids, grades K through 12. I've tried to include all of them that I know personally. So anybody I was in class with, no matter if they're currently, identify as ultra left or ultra right or ultra Republican or Democrat or Libertarian or Green or whatever. And I feel so hurt sometimes when some of the comments will come back like, those people don't deserve anything, and we should, if they come to our town, we should, get our guns out and put a bullet in their leg or something. But more, the one that I think is most striking to me is the idea that it's their fault for being poor. It's their fault. It's their fault for being poor. If they just lifted up their bootstraps, and they could, float off the ground, and they could get a job, and if they just did the work, if they just buckled down, if they just followed the rules, then America is a place where anybody can, achieve their dreams and become president even.
Yeah.
And I'm sure you've thought about this quite a bit, but could you share your worldview on this idea that everybody has equality in just what I said?
Well, inequality has a deep history, and it goes all the way back to the earliest agricultural states.
You're talking about 10,000 years ago.
Yeah, 5 to 10,000 years ago. And the early agricultural states, one of the main features was that it was a kind of wealth pump. It was a way of organizing society. So you had these folks on the top, the king and his family and people who worked for him, and then a group of religious functionaries, priests and so on, their helpers, and together.
And this was before religion and state were separated.
Right. I mean, together they siphoned up the surplus wealth of the people who produced it, who were the farmers. And that basic way of operating society has survived all the way to the present. And we try to moderate that wealth pump during certain times of history. We in more recent times we've had of course, revolutions. If people at the bottom become so poor that they just can't get by, sometimes they get together and topple the regime. Or sometimes the regime can moderate itself so as to improve its prospects for longevity by doing things like redistributing wealth, some of the wealth to folks at the bottom, or progressive taxation, taxing people higher up on the wealth pyramid more, and so on. But generally speaking, if you decide to make it your life's work to make as much money as you can, then chances are you're going to end up higher up on the pyramid than somebody who decides to spend their life helping others in some way, or just producing a beautiful experience for everyone by being an artist or musician or something. People who specialize in finance or in power in one of its many manifestations, are going to rise up that pyramid, and you get to the top, and what do you have at the end? It's usually a miserable life, because you got other people scrambling up after you and wanting to take your place, and a lot of people resenting you because of what you had to do to get to the top. And that's, in some ways, that's a good picture of our current president. I mean, he's a guy he's evidently not a very happy individual. How often do you hear him cracking a joke or exhibiting a sense of humor or enjoying anything? Really, all he knows is power, either in wealth or in political dominance, how to get it and how to try to maintain it. And it's a grim existence, but that's a certain way of operating in the world, and it has a long and deep history, and it's kind of interesting to see it playing out in front of our noses right now.
It's interesting that you bring all this up, because over the weekend, I've been working with some people who contacted me from Africa, one in Uganda, one in Kenya, one in Ghana, and one in Burkina Faso. And three of them, two young men, about 20 years old, they're trying to grow permaculture gardens with their community. Another one is trying to build a permaculture garden, but also put like wells in so that people have wells. And then another one is just, she's struggling in the city to try to make a living for herself so she can be with her family. Speaking of Ghana, the young man there was mentioning to me yesterday that there's no food there, and it's not just him. It's like everyone. It's even the rich people, so to speak, the rich Ghanese, the president and whatnot. And when you talk about the poor having less and less and less, this is how it feels to me, like in this global economy, and you're calling it a wealth pump, that it's being pumped from these most vulnerable communities where they have perhaps the least understanding of how this thing works, and so they have no defenses against it.
Yeah, that's always how it's worked. And again, in the deep history of all of this, you can go all the way back to domestication of animals, and how humans learned to shape the behavior of, first dogs, but then later on, cattle and pigs and goats and sheep and so on, and turn them into different versions of themselves that just served, human purposes. And we started using, a long time ago, we started using those same basic techniques to domesticate other humans, basically to capture their energy production for the purposes of some people who were in charge. And that's taken the form of slavery, but also, lots of subtler forms as well. We are a domesticated species. We're self-domesticated, but we're also domesticated by power structures of various kinds. And slavery and racism are two of those structures that maintain power relationships, and for a purpose. It's for the purpose of the wealth pump, ultimately. And changing some rules in terms of police engagement. Well, I mean, that's a good thing, but it's not going to really uproot these thousands of years of how humans have learned to relate to one another.
So like a physician addressing a symptom rather than the root cause.
Yeah, exactly. And so we have some unlearning to do and some renegotiation to do if we're going to get beyond the extreme inequality that we've created. And let's be clear about it. We are living in a time of extreme wealth inequality, both within our country, the United States, which I think is being really destroyed socially, economically, politically, by the rising level of inequality. We have some other problems too, but that's certainly one of the big ones. But also globally, where the United States has historically, by virtue of its geographic and other advantages, when European immigrants arrived here, here was a continent with huge forests and navigable rivers and lots of fossil fuels to be extracted and used. And meanwhile, it was insulated geographically from the wars and intrigues of Europe. So there were these incredible advantages that enabled the US to rise to the top of the stack, and made the 20th century the American century, where the US dollar became the world's reserve currency. And US had troops garrisoned in dozens of other countries around the world to promote its interests, which in many cases meant suppressing democratic movements in those countries, installing dictators or propping up dictators, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. All of that is coming apart before our eyes. It's not just the Trump regime that's toppling right now. In many ways, it's the whole American hegemony, the whole economic and political and geopolitical structure that dominated the world during the 20th century. And so this is what we're going to be living through for the rest of our lives, whether we're 20 years old or 70 years old. Just as the American century was a long process of the buildup of American wealth and power, the 21st century is going to be a great deal about the devolution of that power. And we may see other powers like China rise up, relatively speaking, at least for a certain period of time. But we also have to be aware of the bigger arc of ecological history, the fact that the way the US became the superpower was by modeling a form of economic wealth extraction, a form of wealth pump that involved, using energy to extract raw materials, turn them into products, which then became waste. And to do this at an ever accelerating pace, economic growth, which is having the effects of climate change, species extinctions, resource depletion, et cetera, which force a crisis, which is, again, what we will be living through for the rest of our lives. It's an interesting time to be on the planet. So much is up for renegotiation. So much is shifting beneath our feet. And it's for those who have some foresight and some interest in operating in a pro-social way, to improve the prospects of the people around them and future generations, we have a big job on our hands.
Is it okay if I share a couple thoughts and ask a question?
Sure.
So a couple thoughts. My working hypothesis on the origins of this, well, I have two working hypotheses, three working hypotheses.
By the way, Aaron, are you typing while you're speaking?
No, do you hear a little clatter?
Yeah, there's clatter going on.
I'm sorry,
background.
that might just be the connection. But so
Okay.
one thing you point out, going back to domestication, William Catton points out that it goes back to the use of fire and being able to exert control at a distance using fire, and fire being destructive of the environment. So that's number one of three.
Yeah.
Number two is for these children who are starving to death in orphanages in Western Uganda, a single dollar worth of food for beans would probably feed a person for 5 days on just minimal calories. And so from that perspective, when I think of money being the ability to get food at the most base level. And that's what money's core value is, that money is equal to food for people. But number three, that there are a couple competing parts of our brain. There's the fear center, the terror center, the freeze, flee, fight response, which is kind of the fish brain back here. And then there's the mammal brain, the conscious mind, which is able to see what this part is doing and feel it, and is able to like stop whatever the person is doing. And this is the love center, basically. This is the compassion center. This is everybody, we care for everybody. And that's something, it's not necessarily right here. I mean, I don't think it's just mammals that have this. I think birds have this as well. But so those are the three reflections. And I want to interject that just because I haven't interjected those in this show before. But then, and you're welcome to touch on those as you wish. But I understand you've written a paper about the United States and the possibility of the U.S. kind of dissolving as far as a nation. And I'm wondering, does that go back to the ideas of the 5 stages of collapse that happened with the USSR when it collapsed? And if there's any parallels. I know Dmitry Orlov wrote a whole paper on this, and people who are kind of in our circle, he wrote a book on this, are kind of familiar with the idea that first international collapses and then national, and then it goes down to state, and hopefully state holds, otherwise it collapses down to like county and city.
Right.
So,
well, we're seeing that process begin to play out. I mean, the cracks are appearing. More and more state governors are starting to collaborate along the Pacific Northwest, the Northeast, Midwest. And it started out just with, PPE procurement, during the pandemic, because the federal government was so dysfunctional, it was actually undermining the efforts of the states. So now Gavin Newsom, who's the governor of California, has taken to talking about California as a nation state. And of course, that's a symbolic statement at this point, because as he points out, it's just a shorthand way of noting how big California's economy is relative to the other states in the US, and that if it existed on its own, it would be the 5th biggest economy in the world. And okay, fine. But why is he actually making a point of saying that? Because, increasingly the California's relationship with the rest of the United States is not helpful to Californians. And California, in many ways, would be better off if it existed on its own or in a loose alliance with states in the Pacific Northwest. And other states are making that same calculation. Now, there are some things obviously that states can't do, like they don't have a military establishment. They can't print money and run up big deficits. There are workarounds, you know, state banks could enable states to create money to fund projects beyond what is brought in through taxation. And I wouldn't be surprised to see some of these workarounds start to come into place. The dysfunctionality of the federal government, of course, has gotten much, much worse under the Trump regime. But I wonder how much that's going to change, assuming there's a new face in the White House over the next, in the next few months. Because some of the trends that have created this dysfunctionality are, again, deeper and older trends. We started seeing them all the way back in the 1960s and 70s with the Vietnam War, the increasing polarization, increasing wealth inequality within the country, and then newer trends like social media, which sort of have undermined Americans' shared sense of what is even real. I think have brought these trends to a boiling point, and the year 2020 may end up being sort of a key point in America's history, where the scale of political and economic organization that we have maintained up to this point becomes no longer tenable. That doesn't mean that America will disappear, but that we're going to have to start finding other arrangements, and quickly. Now, I know different people have different opinions as to whether Trump was put in office by Vladimir Putin and Russian intelligence and so on. But, you know, if that's the case, it was a very small investment for a very successful project, because it's very clear that America's status in the world as a hegemon and as an exemplar has been almost completely eroded just within the last few months, especially over the last 3 years, but certainly even just within the last few months. So America as a superpower is fading fast. How long will the dollar remain the world's reserve currency? And when that changes, that will change the economic equation for the U.S. Pretty dramatically and overnight. So a lot of things are converging to really shift the not just the global balance of power as geopoliticians talk about, but really the whole fabric of history is going to be rewoven in before our eyes.
If you were to conjecture, or not project, but just say, like when I'm talking with David Korowitz of Ireland, he'll say, you got to kind of look at it as probabilities, and that there are like these various states that society can be into, and you don't just smoothly move from one state to the next mm-hmm. like Dmitry Orlov is talking about. It kind of you kind of drop to the next one like a stair step, and then you're on that one, and then you drop to the next one. But the probability isn't like 100%. Like you can't say 100% that in 2020 something's going to happen like this. But yeah. I mean, what is your outlook on, for example, the future of the United States? I mean, we titled this video, what was it? The United States an obituary. I mean, you suggested that title. What are you trying to get at there?
Well, what I'm saying is I think it's pretty clear that the U.S. as a global hegemon has seen its last days, and 2020 is going to be a clear shifting point in that trajectory. Now, whether the U.S. comes apart in some formal way and dissolves into regional governments, I don't know. I mean, maybe we'll be able to keep it together. It's entirely possible. There, as you say, nobody has a 100% functioning crystal ball around here. But the trends are I think not only unmistakable, but also at some of the trends have gone beyond the point of being able to be interrupted or reversed. And I would say that those that have gone to that point are the U.S. as a global exemplar and economic and political hegemon. I think we've definitely reached a turning point in that regard. And we started out talking about the Trump regime and the America's slide into despotism. That trend, I think, is probably being reversed. But what replaces it? That's going to be a really interesting outworking over the next while, because Trump may go away. I think it's very likely at this point that he's being toppled. He's on his way out. But what happens to all the energy that put Trump in the first place and propped him up for these 3+ years? That energy is not going away, and it's going to, how is it going to come back? How is it going to figure into the equation from here on? It's nobody knows the answer to that question.
This reminds me of, in a way, the Depression after World War I, where there was this huge speculative bubble, and the stock market crash of 1929 kind of was a signal. But then it was years and years of poverty, especially for the farmers, not to be reversed until FDR said, everybody, you got a job, and you come and build this park, you come and plant these trees, you come and do this stuff. It seems to me that at the state level that could be done. I mean, the states, a lot of them grow enough food. They have enough cafeterias in schools. You could take the food to the schools, make meals for everybody, and in the morning you could say, hey, everybody go plant apple trees and fruit trees and gardens, and then come back and have a meal. And there could be a role still in for large scale organization and making the future better.
Right, and what you said just triggered something in my mind, which is that another big turning point is going to have to do with how we respond to inequality, how we deal with this huge buildup and backlog of economic inequality, because we will deal with it some way. How we did it in 2008 and 2009 was part of what led to even deepening crisis. When Obama came in after the crisis of 2008, he made a terrible mistake, I think, and I'm sure there were perfectly good reasons for it, but the way the country got bailed out was that investors got bailed out first. And so, trillions went to the investor class, no bankers went to jail, and everybody else got, the trickle down dregs. And as a result, economic inequality continued to increase in the country right up to the present. So now we have another even worse economic crisis as a result of the pandemic, with officially 13% unemployment, but it's probably closer to 20%. And how is the government responding? Well, so far it's been bailing out Wall Street. That's why the Dow Jones is at, whatever it is, 26,000 instead of where it probably should be, which is more like 13,000. Because basically the Treasury and especially the Federal Reserve have just shoved a few $1 trillion into the pockets of investors. If that doesn't change, if our way of dealing with the problem of financial crisis and inequality doesn't shift, it's going to just create another worse crisis until the whole thing falls apart. And we might be at that point now. I mean, we could be very close to the point where that way of papering over the problems just fails, and the folks in charge are forced to find another way, or they're just shoved out the door. But it couldn't happen soon enough, because all they've done so far is to make the problem worse, and to ensure that the crisis, when it comes, is even more acute.
I want to be mindful of your time, Richard, and we're at about 45 minutes. So, whatever thought you would like to share that you think might be a good thought to share. I mean, I'm happy to stay on as long as you like, but
yeah, no, I think we can wrap up now. And I think it's probably a good place to end would be to recap what we started with. It's, you have to take your victories when they come and savor them and appreciate them, especially when you're in a time of overall, craziness and challenge. And I think the last week or two has been a time that most Americans can be proud of. Going out in the street is a courageous thing to do, and a lot of people have done that, and it is having an impact on history. So let's sit back and appreciate that, pat ourselves and each other on the shoulder. And at the same time, we don't need to have any illusions that somehow it's all over and we fixed all our problems. There's still a lot to be dealt with.
And for action items.
For action items?
For what I'm doing here and my wife and I are doing is we're trying to grow this garden. I mean, we are not gardeners, but we're trying, and we put together our boxes, and I was moving dirt yesterday, and we planted some strawberries that the neighbors gave us, and we're trying to connect with our neighbors. And you have Post Carbon has a whole course on education.resilience.org. Do you just want to pitch that?
Yeah, it's a course called Think Resilience, and it's 4 hours of video, but it's broken up into 22 short segments, so you can go through the course at your own pace, and it really takes the viewer through, how we got to where we are as a species right now, and what our options are, and what you can do in your community to build resilience and help create a foundation for a sustainable and equitable future.
And is that it? Is it education.resilience.org?
I believe so.
And
yeah.
Is there how much is the fee to take the course? Do you know?
It's free right now.
It is.
Yes.
Apparently, it's an important time to have a free course like that.
Yeah, well, when the pandemic hit, we said, "Oh, this is too important to be, doling out on a fee basis." So right now, it's free.
I looked at about the first hour and a half of it. It was outstanding. So for any viewer, I recommend you go log in, make your free account, start watching the videos. And Richard is so patient. I mean, he's the patient explainer of each thing, and I was so appreciative that you were just very calm on each little video segment. You're taking your time, and so thank you so much for making that.
Yeah, it was a pleasure, and it was I was very happy to have the resources at hand, like a good teleprompter and a good videographer, and we worked for weeks on the script, and then afterward we were able to put in a lot of resources that if I say something in the video and you go, well, what was that? What does that mean? I want to find out more about? Well, there's the resource there that you can look to find out more.
Before I say goodbye, for all the viewers, if you could please, put a thumbs up for Richard's time. He's a very busy man. He's got a lot of stuff to do. And comments, whatever you want to write down there, subscribe and put your email in so that you can get notifications. And thank you so much, Richard. I wish all the best to you and all your good work.
Well, thank you, Aaron, and the same to you.
All right. Thank you. Bye-bye.
Yeah. Bye.